3 days after the flood, I was standing ankle-deep in black water, holding a ruined hand plane that had belonged to my father, and half a mile away a bunch of retirees were teeing off on bright green fairways like nothing had happened. That's the part that still sticks with me. Not the money, not even the damage. It was the fact that somebody knew exactly where that water was going to end up, and they decided my life was an acceptable sacrifice. My name is Ethan Calloway, and I've lived in Ridge Creek County for most of my 56 years. My father bought our property back in 1978 when the land was considered practically worthless, too rocky for farming, too isolated for development, and every winter the wind came screaming through the valley like it had a personal grudge against everybody living there. My dad loved it anyway. He always said the best places were the ones nobody else wanted. The house we lived in wasn't much to look at. Half the walls leaned a little if you stared long enough, and every spring there was some new repair waiting for us. But every board in that house had a story attached to it. My father built most of it with his own hands after working 10-hour shifts at the paper mill. When I turned 19, we built a workshop behind the house. Nothing fancy, just salvage timber from an old church demolition, a concrete slab we poured ourselves, and a roof that leaked every time the weather got angry. But it was ours. Over the years, I turned that little workshop into a woodworking business. Custom cabinets, farm tables, porch swings, built-ins, the kind of work that never made anybody rich but kept food on the table and gave me something meaningful to do every morning. After my father passed away, that shop became more than a workplace. It became the last place where I still felt close to him. Every tool hanging on those walls carried a memory. Every scratch on every workbench had a story behind it. Then the developers arrived. About 12 years ago, they bought the land west of mine and started building a luxury golf community called Silverthorne Greens. Now, if you've ever seen one of these places, you already know the type. Stone entrance signs, decorative fountains, matching mailboxes, perfect sidewalks. Every house looking like it came out of the same catalog. The marketing brochures promised elegant country living. The reality was an HOA with way too much free time. At first, we mostly ignored each other. They played golf. I cut wood. Everybody stayed happy. Then little things started happening. Letters showed up in my mailbox claiming my fence was visually inconsistent with community standards. Community standards for a fence that wasn't even inside their community. One resident complained that the sound of my planer interrupted outdoor relaxation hours. Another complained about sawdust drifting across a property line during a windy afternoon. My personal favorite came from a woman named Cheryl who informed me that my stacked lumber created what she called an aggressive visual presence. I remember laughing so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. Aggressive lumber. That's still one of the funniest things I've ever heard. But looking back now, I think those complaints were warning signs. Because eventually people stop seeing neighbors. They start seeing obstacles. And once that happens, it's amazing what they'll justify. The flood started with a smell. I woke up around 5 in the morning because something felt wrong. There was this heavy scent of wet cedar, mud, mildew, and stagnant water hanging in the air. I pulled on my boots and headed toward the workshop, thinking maybe a pipe had burst overnight. The second I opened the door, my stomach dropped. Water. Everywhere. Dark, muddy water covering the entire floor. Toolboxes floating. Cabinet doors drifting across the room. Extension cords hanging from benches like seaweed. My table saw sat half submerged. My joiner was underwater. And against the far wall, nearly 8 months of drying walnut lumber had already started warping. I just stood there frozen. You know those moments when your brain refuses to process what your eyes are seeing? That's where I was. Completely stuck. Then I heard somebody yelling my name. It was my neighbor Hank Turner running across the field. Hank had spent 30 years repairing diesel engines and looked exactly like you'd imagine. Grease under his fingernails, warm baseball cap, coffee thermos permanently attached to one hand. He stepped inside, looked around slowly, and let out a low whistle. "Damn, Ethan." That's all he said at first. Then he crouched near the back wall and stared at the water moving across the floor. A few seconds later, his expression changed, and that's when everything started. because Hank looked up at me and said 5 words that would eventually bring an entire golf community to its knees. "This ain't rainwater, buddy." And standing there in the middle of my ruined workshop, I suddenly realized he was right. "This ain't rainwater, buddy." I remember looking at Hank like he had lost his mind. "What do you mean it ain't rainwater?" I asked. He pointed toward the back of the shop where muddy water kept slipping through gaps near the foundation. "Look at the direction." At first I didn't understand. Then I crouched down beside him. The water wasn't draining away from the creek. It was coming from it. That shouldn't have been possible. Our property sat slightly higher than the natural runoff channel. For water to move the way it was moving, something had to be forcing it. The two of us spent the next few hours pushing water out with shop vacs, brooms, and pure stubbornness, but it was like trying to empty a bathtub while somebody kept turning the faucet back on. By noon, we were soaked, exhausted, and no closer to stopping it. That's when Hank slapped his muddy gloves against his leg and said, "Let's go find out where it's coming from." So we did. We grabbed our boots and started walking through the woods behind my property. The farther we went, the stranger things looked. Fresh mud, broken brush, tree limbs pushed aside. Eventually, we reached a section of forest that had been disturbed recently. The dirt was still loose. Grass had been torn up, and cutting directly through the trees was a newly dug drainage trench. I stared at it for several seconds. The trench wasn't old. This thing had been cut recently. Maybe days, maybe weeks. Water rushed through it like a miniature river. Hank stepped closer and kicked at the edge. The soil collapsed immediately. "Fresh work," he muttered. We followed the trench uphill, and that's when we saw where it led. Straight towards Silverthorne Greens. Straight toward their stormwater management system. Straight toward the golf course. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The only sound was rushing water. Then Hank shook his head slowly. "Well," he said, "looks like somebody solved their flooding problem." I wish I could tell you I immediately knew what was happening. I didn't. I wanted there to be another explanation. A contractor mistake. A temporary construction issue. An accident. Anything except what it looked like. But deep down I already knew. Because over the years, I'd watched Silverthorne's management operate. Whenever a problem appeared, they found somebody else to absorb the inconvenience. And apparently this time, that somebody was me. That afternoon, I drove up to the clubhouse. The place looked exactly like you'd expect. Stone columns, polished floors, huge windows overlooking perfect fairways. The kind of building designed to make ordinary people feel slightly out of place. The receptionist smiled politely and asked how she could help. I told her I needed to speak with the community manager. A few minutes later, I was shown into a large office where I met a man named Preston Hale. Preston was one of those people who somehow managed to look expensive. Perfect haircut, perfect watch, perfect smile. The kind of smile that never actually reaches the eyes. He motioned toward a chair. "What can I do for you, Mr. Calloway?" I explained everything. The flooding, the trench, the damage, the ruined tools, the destroyed lumber. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Then he gave me an answer that sounded rehearsed. Silverthorne Greens operates fully within county regulations. I stared at him. That's not what I asked. He smiled again. Our drainage improvements were approved by licensed engineers. My workshop is underwater. Heavy rainfall affects everyone. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Outside his office window, I could see golfers moving across bright green grass. Not a puddle in sight. Meanwhile, my father's workshop looked like a swamp. I pointed toward the course. "You got people out there golfing right now." He glanced outside. So my life just got destroyed." His expression never changed. "I'm sure insurance will handle the situation." Insurance. That word hit me like a punch. Because he had no idea what he was talking about. Or maybe he did. Insurance couldn't replace my father's tools. Insurance couldn't replace decades of memories. Insurance couldn't replace handmade jigs, custom fixtures, old notebooks filled with measurements, or pieces of what I'd been saving for years. He knew that. Or at least he should have. I left before I said something stupid. That night, I sat inside the workshop long after dark. The electricity was still off. Rain tapped softly against the roof. Water dripped somewhere in the shadows. And for the first time since the flood happened, I felt something stronger than anger. I felt betrayed. My father used to believe most problems could be solved by talking. He believed neighbors should help each other. He believed a handshake meant something. But sitting there in that ruined workshop, I couldn't stop thinking about Preston's face. That smile. That complete lack of concern. Like my losses existed only as numbers on a spreadsheet. Around midnight, I opened my laptop. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for. Maybe evidence. Maybe answers. Maybe just something to keep me from sitting in the dark replaying the day over and over. I started digging through county property records, survey maps, permit applications, drainage filings, old zoning documents. Hours passed. The house got quiet. Even the rain stopped. Then somewhere around 2 in the morning, I found something that made me sit upright. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I zoomed in, checked again, then checked a third time. There, on the updated county survey, was a structure labeled Pump Station 3, the irrigation pump house for Silverthorne Greens. And according to the property boundaries, it wasn't on golf course land. It wasn't on shared access land. It wasn't on county property. It was sitting entirely inside my property line. I blinked, looked again. Still there, 11 feet inside my boundary. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I drove straight to the county records office. If you've ever been inside a rural county records building, you know the vibe. Old fluorescent lights, dusty file cabinets, people who have worked there longer than some buildings have existed. The clerk helping me was named Marlene. She'd probably been working that counter since the invention of fire. She took one look at the stack of maps under my arm and laughed. Well, somebody's fixing to start trouble. I hope not. She smiled. That usually means yes. For the next hour, she helped me pull every document connected to Silverthorne Greens. Water permits, land transfers, utility easements, maintenance agreements, everything. Finally, she adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to the monitor. Then she frowned. I felt my pulse quicken. What? She clicked through several more records, then looked directly at me. Unless there's some private agreement nobody filed. She paused. They don't have legal water access. I wasn't sure I heard her correctly. What do you mean? I mean they've been drawing water through a pump located on your property without a recorded easement. You still there? She stared back. Then she smiled. Slowly. Oh, honey, she said. Looks like somebody got real comfortable using something that doesn't belong to them. The drive home felt different. The anger was still there. The damage was still there. But underneath it, something else had appeared. Calm. The dangerous kind. The kind that shows up when somebody finally realizes they aren't powerless. That afternoon, Hank came by carrying sandwiches and a six-pack. He found me standing near the pond staring at a small concrete building sitting beneath a group of old oak trees. The pump house. Silverthorne's lifeline. Hank looked at the building, then looked at me, then looked back at the building. You thinking what I think you're thinking? I held up the property survey. He studied it. A slow grin spread across his face. Oh, he laughed. Oh, this is going to get interesting. I looked across the water toward the golf course shimmering in the distance. Then I glanced back at the pump house. For the first time since the flood happened, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what they needed. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something very important. Silverthorne Greens had spent years believing they held all the leverage. They had the money, the lawyers, the influence, the fancy offices. What they didn't realize was that every perfectly watered blade of grass on that golf course depended on a little concrete building sitting quietly on my land. And by the following sunrise, that fact was about to become a very expensive problem. By sunrise the next morning, I was standing beside the pump house holding a length of heavy steel chain and the biggest padlock I could find at Miller's Hardware. The pond was covered in mist. Birds were waking up. Everything felt strangely peaceful. I wrapped the chain through the handles, pulled it tight, slid the lock into place, and listened to the click. That was it. No shouting. No dramatic speeches. No fireworks. Just one simple click. Then I turned around and walked back home. For the first 24 hours, nothing happened. The second day, things got interesting. The irrigation pressure started dropping. Certain sprinkler zones stopped reaching full coverage. Ground crews began checking valves. Maintenance crews started making phone calls. By day 3, Panic started spreading. And here's something I've learned. Regular people worry quietly. HOA boards panic like they're auditioning for a reality show. Suddenly, homeowners were receiving emergency emails. Meetings were being scheduled. Committees were being formed. Everybody wanted answers. Nobody had any. Then Preston Hale showed up. A black SUV rolled into my driveway around lunchtime. I was rebuilding storage shelves inside the workshop when he stepped out. No smile this time. No polished confidence. Just frustration. He walked over and stopped a few feet away. "Mr. Calloway." I kept working. "Afternoon. We've identified an issue with one of our irrigation facilities." "That's unfortunate." His jaw tightened. "The pump station appears inaccessible." I set my hammer down. "Sure does." He stared at me. I stared back. Finally, he said, "You can't interfere with community infrastructure." I reached into my back pocket, unfolded the survey map, and handed it to him. Community infrastructure sitting on whose property? For a few seconds, he didn't speak. Then he looked at the map, then back at me. And for the first time since I'd met him, I saw uncertainty. Real uncertainty. He left without another word. Things unraveled quickly after that. July arrived with record heat. Without enough water, sections of the golf course started turning yellow, then brown, then completely dead. Homeowners complained. Golfers complained. The resort guests complained. Membership cancellations started appearing. Social media posts spread everywhere. People were posting side-by-side photos comparing the course from 1 month earlier. The difference looked brutal. Perfect green fairways transformed into patchy fields. Meanwhile, county investigators finally started examining the drainage trench behind my property. Once they started digging through permits and reports, more problems surfaced. The trench hadn't been reviewed properly. Environmental approvals were questionable. Runoff calculations didn't match actual field conditions. Every week seemed to bring another unpleasant discovery. And every discovery pushed Silverthorne deeper into trouble. Then came the legal letter. Certified mail. Large envelope. Expensive Nashville law firm. The whole thing practically smelled like billable hours. The letter demanded immediate restoration of water access. Threatened lawsuits. Threatened damages. Threatened court action. Very intimidating. Except for one problem. Attached to their legal filing was a property exhibit. And on that exhibit, the pump house was clearly shown inside my property boundary. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled coffee all over the porch. They had accidentally documented their own problem. That was when I called my cousin Travis. Travis handled contract negotiations for a commercial construction company in Knoxville. He's one of those guys who sounds relaxed even while dismantling someone's entire argument. After I explained everything, he went silent for a few seconds. Then he said, "Ethan, they handed you the winning lottery ticket and signed the back of it." Over the next week, we assembled documentation, repair estimates, equipment losses, structural damage, mold remediation, destroyed inventory, lost business revenue, everything. Then Travis added one more category, unauthorized commercial water usage, 12 years worth. When we finished calculating the numbers, I stared at the total. Even I thought it looked painful. Silverthorne's board definitely agreed. 3 days later, Preston arrived again. This time he wasn't angry. He was desperate. The confidence was gone. The corporate polish was gone. Stress had carved deep lines beneath his eyes. He walked onto my porch carrying a folder. "This amount is unreasonable." I took a sip of coffee. "So is flooding my property. You're exploiting a technicality." "No, Iravia. I'm enforcing one." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked toward the pond. "The golf course supports hundreds of homeowners." I nodded. Then maybe somebody should have protected the water source. The look on his face was unforgettable. Not rage. Not hatred. Disbelief. Like he genuinely couldn't understand why somebody he considered insignificant wasn't cooperating. August arrived. The heat got worse. Water trucks started appearing every morning. Thousands of gallons hauled in at enormous expense. Homeowners began openly fighting with board members. Lawsuits were being discussed. Local newspapers picked up the story. Public opinion turned ugly. And eventually the county completed its investigation. The findings were devastating. Once those reports became official, Silverthorne's position collapsed. Completely. A few weeks later, Preston called and asked if we could meet. Not as adversaries, as reasonable men. I almost laughed, but curiosity won. So we met at the Clubhouse restaurant overlooking what used to be one of the nicest golf courses in the county. The grass outside looked tired, brittle, half alive, a perfect reflection of the people managing it. Preston slid a folder across the table. The board is prepared to offer compensation. I opened it. The number was insulting, barely enough to cover a fraction of my losses. I looked out the window for a long moment. Then I closed the folder. You know what your biggest problem is? He rubbed his temples. I'm sure you'll tell me. You spent so many years treating people like obstacles that you forgot one day an obstacle might stop moving. His expression hardened. This situation has gone too far. I leaned forward. No, my father's workshop sitting underwater was too far. Silence. For the first time, I thought I saw genuine regret. Then his phone vibrated. He looked down. The moment disappeared. Business returned. Calculations returned. The mask returned. Finally, he asked the question that mattered. What do you want? So I told him. Full reconstruction costs. Full replacement value. Written acknowledgement of responsibility. A formal long-term commercial lease for pond access. Annual payments due every January. And one final condition. The right to terminate access immediately if the agreement was ever violated again. He stared at me, then slowly shook his head. You'd hold an entire community hostage over a workshop. I looked him straight in the eye. No, my voice stayed calm. You flooded a man's life to protect grass. 3 weeks later, they signed everything. Every page, every clause, every condition. Because by then, they had no alternatives left. The money arrived. Construction began. The old damaged workshop was demolished. Watching them tear it apart hurt more than I expected. It felt like losing my father all over again. But then something unexpected happened. The rebuild started. Stronger foundation, better drainage, better lighting, better equipment. By Christmas, the new workshop stood where the old one had been, only stronger. The first evening I worked there again, Hank stopped by carrying 2 beers. We stood quietly watching cedar shavings curl across a brand new workbench. After a while, he smiled. Well, he said, that's one hell of a renovation project. I laughed. Most expensive remodel I ever did. Years have passed since then. Silverthorne greens recovered. The fairways turned green again. The ponds sparkle again. The newsletters talk about community values and neighborly cooperation like none of this ever happened. Every January, a certified check arrives exactly on schedule. Every January, I walk down to the pump house, inspect the equipment, lock the gate, and head back to my workshop. Same lock, same click, and honestly, sometimes I still wonder if I went too far. My father probably would have tried harder to find peace. Maybe he would have found a way to settle everything with coffee and conversation. Maybe, but every time I start questioning myself, I remember standing in black floodwater watching 30 years of work disappear while somebody in a pressed polo shirt told me insurance would handle it. And suddenly the guilt doesn't last very long. Now here's what I'd love to hear from you. Was I wrong? Did I let pride take over and push things further than necessary? Or was this one of those rare situations where the only way to stop people from abusing power was to make sure they finally paid a price they couldn't ignore? Let me know down in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with difficult neighbors, HOA boards, property disputes, or somebody who thought they could walk all over you without consequences, share your story below. Because sometimes the biggest fights don't happen in courtrooms or boardrooms. Sometimes they happen right next door.